Good afternoon, class, and welcome to Chapter 10, Style and Delivery. Let's get you going on this chapter, shall we? We've been talking a little bit here and there throughout the last few chapters when it comes to style and delivery, but this one fully focuses on it. It has to do with your nonverbal communication. It has to do with more than just your words. It has to do with your voice and your body. Your voice and your body says a lot about not only you, but the speech that you're about to give. So, what I've always asked you is about your speaker's voice to own it. And by owning it through your volume, you own your speech, you own your voice, and it will be very powerful. Don't be too loud and don't be too soft. Now, while this may sound off, you don't know who's going to hear you in the back. And what you want to do is make sure that you are as articulate for the people that are listening to you in the front as well as the back. A lot of your style and delivery has to do with pitch and inflection. We've gone through this over and over again. It gives the speech life, it gives the speech character, and it gives the speech passion. Even as you speak extemporaneously, you carefully practice with your pitch and with your inflection. And carefully practicing gives you advantages. It gives you that conversational quality. It gives you an opportunity to control your pitch and inflection. And it also makes you sound spontaneous even while you have practiced as much as you have. When it comes to style and delivery, you always have to control your rates, your pauses, and your vocal variety. You don't want to go too fast, and you certainly don't want to go too slow. Pauses, as mentioned in the past and in previous chapters, can be deliberate and they can actually add to your advantage. And how you choose to have vocal variety is entirely up to you. And also what is in the speech. You also have to have articulation because if you're anything like me and you talk too fast, sometimes you stumble over your words. And that's something that you don't want to do because you want everyone to understand exactly what you need to say. Dialect also plays an important role. If you come from anywhere but the Midwest, sometimes it sounds a little off to some people and it is a little bit more difficult to understand. So dialect also plays an important role when it comes to style and delivery. Now, it says here movements, gestures, eye contact. People see you before they hear you. So that being said, just so you understand, it has to do with your eyes. It has to do with your hands. It has to do with your gestures. It has to do with movement as well, because they will see the shell of your body before they actually hear anything that you have to say on paper. If that, and what you end up doing is always trying to control all of this combined together so that way it can be a cohesive speech and not just that, but you will continue to maintain your audience's, what's the word? Attention. Now, all that to be said that it adds impact to the speech, but you should also look natural. Sometimes it's a little bit harder than others, but that's when you practice the words in your speech so that way you could sound more natural and even your gestures will come off natural, a little bit more natural. Maintain as much of a strong voice as you possibly can because your voice plays a pivotal role in your delivery. Be authoritative because what that also does is it adds credibility to your speech. It's not just about the stats, the facts, the figures, the examples, the testimony. Your own style and delivery gives an authoritative role, gives you credibility. Sprinkle the compassion so that way it gives you a humanistic approach, but not so much that it's playfulness. Don't be so laid back because what you want to do is Instead of being laid back where they don't believe you, you want to add that compassion. Your voice actually carries a more lasting impression than the actual words that you are trying to deliver. As we finish off this chapter, what I want you to do is actually watch a presentation about executive presence that talks about everything that this chapter has mentioned. So, that being said, let me find this and away we go.
One of the hottest topics in courses and books nowadays with regard to leadership communication is the concept of executive presence. What does it mean? How do you define it? And can it be taught or learned? The Center for Talent Innovation identified three main pillars of executive presence: appearance, communication skills, and gravitas. And gravitas means things like, do your words have teeth? Are you able to make the tough decisions and stick with them? One of the missing pieces, when you think about what's integrated really between the lines of broad concepts like communication skills and gravitas, is vocal executive presence, as I call it. It's the missing link. How do you sound when you're making those tough decisions? Does your delivery reinforce your message and establish the image that you want, or does it undermine it? What happens if I'm trying to diffuse a tense situation and I say, okay, everybody, just calm down now. We need to reevaluate the situation. Well, at worst, I'm just adding fuel to the fire. And at best, you may later on gently suggest that I switch to decaf. It's about how we connect. I end up working a lot with people who are preparing for presentations and for press conferences, and they make statements like, we're very passionate about helping children and improving the quality of our schools. And I think to myself, really? Because you could have fooled me. There's a claim of passion, but there's no evidence thereof. The problem is a disconnect between the choice of words and their execution, their delivery. And this creates a problem of credibility. Now, there's a historic and seminal study that looked at feelings and attitudes as a result of the consistency or inconsistency in verbal and nonverbal messaging cues. And what they found was that when they asked people to evaluate speakers as far as whether or not they thought the speakers sounded sincere, that 38% of that evaluation was based on the tonality of the speaker's voice. Tonality being things like the ups and the downs in your intonation patterns. In contrast, only 7% of those decisions were based on the speaker's words that they chose. And the remaining 55% were looking at nonverbal cues, based on nonverbal cues like your posture, your eye contact, etc. Now, this is a study. We have to be careful because lots of people love to misquote it. And you'll hear people make grand statements like, well, 55% of all communication is nonverbal. That's not remotely accurate, and it's not what the study was talking about. But what we can take from this study and a lot of subsequent research in the area is the importance of sounding credible. Now, I'd like you to think about this in the context of how you personally prepare for some sort of presentation. Do you spend 38% of your time working on the delivery? If you're like most people, you probably spend the vast majority, if not all of your time, working on the content, your outline, your script, your PowerPoint slides, making sure you've got cool graphics and some snazzy animations, crunching your data to put into your spreadsheets. But then after all that work, we sort of wing the delivery, hoping it'll be good enough. And in the end, that's just comparatively weak. And it can undermine both your immediate goals and objectives, as well as your long-term image and reputation. The fact is, if you want to be seen as a leader, You have to sound like one. You have to demonstrate vocal executive presence. Now, a part of vocal executive presence is the ability to read an audience and identify the kind of person from whom they would be most open to receiving your message, and then figure out what that kind of person would sound like. Now, to an extent, we're all born with the voice that we have, but we do have a lot of control over how we use it. Margaret Thatcher is a great example thereof. She was the first woman in British Parliament, and she was overtly mocked by a lot of her opponents with phrases like, "Methinks the lady doth screech too much." Because when she was passionate in arguing certain points, her voice would go higher and become rather shrill. So when she decided to run for prime minister, she worked with a tutor from the National Theatre who helped her to lower her pitch in order to sound more authoritative. And this is really important because the voice has both cognitive and emotional effects on the listener. Let's start with the cognitive. We talked about tonality, that 38%, the highs and the lows in your voice. And if we use this strategically, we can actually help the listener to focus on the most important words and parts of the message, which makes for a lighter processing load and helps them understand and potentially remember what we're saying. And this can have a persuasive influence. When we listen to speech, we process it in what are called tone units or chunks. And we start first by fixating on the intonation pattern and anchoring what we listen to where those highest peaks are. And then if necessary, we allow our imaginations to sort of fill in whatever's in those lower sound valleys. An example of this is in song lyrics. Now, we've all had the situation where we've been singing along to a favorite song, and suddenly we realize that, or perhaps somebody else not so gently points out, that we've been singing the words wrong. You ever been there? A lot of nodding. There's a classic song, What a Wonderful World by Louis Armstrong. I think everybody knows this one. And in it, there's a line that talks about the bright, blessed day and the dark, sacred night. But when I was a kid, I thought the line was the bright, blessed day and the dogs say goodnight. Now, does this make any sense whatsoever? No, but I accepted it in part because first and foremost, it matches those intonation patterns, and it also matches at those pitch peaks, the vowels, the syllables that are up at the top. And then in the parts that were less salient, that were less emphasized in those pitch valleys, I let myself make up the rest. This also reflects why effective speakers, when they're speaking, will emphasize the most important words with higher pitch. Now, tonality, if we use it strategically, can have a good influence on our very first impressions in attempting to establish ourselves as leaders from the moment we meet somebody. It's really important, of course, to make a good, strong, memorable first impression. But this is difficult when a lot of people feel like they're not even good at remembering people's names. You ever feel like that? Well, I'm going to absolve you of about half of that blame. And that's because when most people introduce themselves to you, they pronounce their own names wrong. Okay, well, technically maybe not wrong, but they pronounce them in a way that uses a rhythm and an intonation pattern that does make it more difficult for you to understand what they're saying. And by the way, I absolve you of only half of that responsibility because the other half of the time, you're the one introducing yourself to somebody else. So if I want to know that I'm introducing myself and helping the listener to really understand my name, and by understanding, then they can hopefully remember it and thereby remember me, I want to start by letting my voice go up like this on your first name, as if to say, I'm not finished yet. And then at the top, we'll have a little break, that little pause that will allow for a sound break to indicate a word boundary. And then on our last name, we want to go down, let the pitch fall, as if to say, and now I'm done, like you're putting a little vocal period at the end. So instead of blurring your way through your introduction, like, hi, my name is Laura Sicola, and blah, 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 I want to focus and help my listener to understand, and so I'll do my best to say to them, hi, my name is Laura Sicola. And you'll be amazed at the difference the strategic tonality can make, even in something this small. Now, of course, if we're haphazard in our use of intonation and putting it in the wrong place, we can have the exact opposite effect. We can distract the listener's attention from what's most important and make it harder for them to process what we're saying. And one of the most common and, in my opinion, annoying examples of this that's becoming more and more prevalent in society nowadays is a phenomenon called upspeak, otherwise known as uptalk, or more technically, high-rise terminal. And that's the pattern where people are talking and they keep adding these question-like tones at the ends of all of their phrases and sentences, you know, like they're implying a bunch of little okays and rights one after another, like there's some sort of deep-seated insecurity and pathological need for constant validation. You know? The problem with talking like that is that what ends up becoming emphasized is just whatever randomly falls at the end of the phrase. It doesn't help anyone to process what you're saying. And that monotonous lilting upswing time and again can be rather hypnotic. And so after a while, we don't really know if the audience is listening to anything we're saying, much less what. By the way, I should also point out that this is not just a Valley Girl kind of phenomenon like a lot of people seem to attribute it. More and more nowadays, this vocal crime against humanity is being perpetrated by men and women, old and young, highly educated and lesser educated. So congratulations, guys, you've closed the gender gap. Way to leave. So from there, one of the other issues is that when people, of course, hear upspeak, they tend to have a very negative and even visceral response. It's not only the antithesis of vocal authority, it's almost like the vocal equivalent of hair twirling, you know? So when people have that visceral response, this will bring us to now talk about the emotional effects of voice. Let's start by thinking about some people who have really distinct voices. We'll start with James Earl Jones, perhaps best known as the iconic voice of Darth Vader. Now, in my opinion, with that deep, rich bass voice that he has, he could read the ingredients off the back of a bottle of shampoo and it would sound like poetry. But he probably would not have been as successful if he had tried to play the role of Elmo on Sesame Street. Yeah. What about someone like Fran Drescher? With that completely unmistakable, whiny, nasal voice right out of Queens, New York. She was great on TV as the nanny, but she probably would have been less successful as Darth Vader. Can you imagine her standing over Luke Skywalker saying, "Luke, I am your father"? It just so doesn't work. Now that's a great voice for comic relief, but it's not necessarily the voice that you want to encounter when you're looking for a funeral director. It's all about context. In the funeral context, you're looking for someone who sounds sympathetic, who sounds compassionate, who sounds like you can trust them to take care of you and your family during your time of greatest emotional need. And the problem is that when we find someone who has a voice that we find unpleasant or somehow that seems to lack the characteristics of the kind of person we're looking for, doesn't sound like that kind of person, we can tune them out. We can sort of shut down and we don't even want to hear the rest of the message, no matter how important the information is. Subconsciously, we really want the messenger's voice to fit the message. Now, does that mean that vocal executive presence is about acting? No, on the contrary, it's the exact opposite. You have to be authentic. You have to be yourself, but the key is to recognize which parts of your personality need to shine through in a particular moment and how to transmit that through your voice and speech style. Now, you're listening to me here today in part because the way that I'm presenting to you makes sense to you and will match your expectations for what a TED Talk speaker should sound like. But I can't use this same speech style when I'm talking to my 3-year-old nephew. He'd wonder what happened to Aunt Laura because I don't sound like fun anymore, and he'd probably stop playing with me. But at the same time, I can't come here today and talk to you in the same way that I talk to him. Can you imagine if I started by saying, "Hey everybody, I got a great idea. Let's talk about vocal executive presence." You'd be like, "Are you kidding me? Who is this nut? What can she possibly know about leadership or executive anything?" And for that matter, who invited her? And by the way, it was them. So I call it working your prismatic voice. In the end, I'm not acting. It's just a matter of recognizing and being aware of the two audiences' different needs and expectations, and then identifying which parts of my personality I want to let come through and how, in order to ensure your openness to my message. And with regard to the notion, the metaphor of the prismatic voice, in many ways, in the same way that white light will pass through a prism and break into all the colors of the rainbow that make up that white light, when the white light of your personality passes through the prism of some situational context, you need to look at all of the colors that are available, all the different parts of your personality, and decide which one you need to highlight in the moment and how, in order to be most effective and appropriate for that moment. And if you can figure out how to do that successfully, then you can create your own unique and authentic sound of leadership. Thank you.
Well, I hope that video helped you in relation to this chapter 10.
My name is Scott Harris.
Oops, you can hear that in the background. I will be closing that. There we go. As I said, I hope this video actually helps you in relation to chapter 10 when it comes to style and delivery. She spoke a lot when it came to tonality, when it came to being deliberate, when it came to being passionate, when it came to just owning your voice in different ways than I contributed to this chapter. Nonetheless, I hope this video actually helps you move forward with all of your speeches.